Hi folks, Seth Leapson here. Thanks for watching my monologue. In these uncertain times, you may be thinking about personal protection. If you are, I urge you to visit my friends at Guns Etc. They'll help you find the perfect protection for yourself and your family, and they can even teach you how to use it. They've been protecting Arizonans for over 33 years, and they stand for the great principles this country was founded upon. Or you can just click on gunsetc.com. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. This is CNN yesterday, and as I read this, I'm guessing CNN's story doesn't say what CNN thinks it says, doesn't mean what CNN thinks it means, if I may borrow from The Princess Bride. In regard to investigating the Capitol Hill riots last week, quote, evidence uncovered so far, including weapons and tactics seen on surveillance videos, suggests a level of planning that has led investigators to believe the attack on the U.S. Capitol was not just a protest that spiraled out of control, a federal law enforcement official says. Among the evidence the FBI is examining are indications that some participants at the Trump rally at the Ellipse outside the White House left the event early, perhaps to retrieve items to be used in the assault on the Capitol, close quote. In other words, the investigation has now taken a turn in the belief that the rioters were not, in fact, inspired by Donald Trump's speech last week, but were planning the riot long before it. So, narrative change. Everyone who voted for Donald Trump is guilty. I give you Chris Cuomo and Don Lemon yesterday. Don Lemon said everyone who voted for Trump is on the side of the KKK. They are part of that crowd. Then everyone, I suppose, who voted for Joe Biden is in agreement and part of Kathy Griffin's crowd? Or the man who shot Steve Scalise because he's a supporter of Bernie Sanders? Everyone who voted for Bernie Sanders is in that shooter's crowd? Collective responsibility. This is, of course, today's as much as it is the traditional justification for group punishment, be it censorship or anything else. And by justification, I mean there is no justification for group punishment and collective responsibility. Collective guilt has been roundly condemned as the ethic of genocide. We see the democratic equivalent of this in politics. As Professor Mark Bauerlein wrote, Republicans are now seen to be an aberration, an irrational upsurge, an eruption of atavism into the sane operations of American democracy. You don't compromise with such cretins. You don't debate them. You get rid of them. Democrats today are not satisfied with winning. They don't gaze across the aisle and see an outnumbered but legitimate opposition. Instead, they spy a group of deplorables who shouldn't even be in the room. Republicans are not to be defeated. They are to be eliminated, removed. This is what all of us need to come to grips with and understand. But if you follow the line of thinking of the left, it's not just Republicans, it's actually all of America. You've heard, that isn't on the left, you've heard me speak of another professor, Ibram Kendi, endowed professor at Boston University. He's the one I mentioned whose group Jack Dorsey donated $10 million to, the professor who said you can't be a capitalist and an anti-racist. He's the same professor who said Amy Barrett was a white colonizer who, to quote, adopted black children to civilize the savage children in the superior ways of white people while using them as props in their lifelong pictures of denial while cutting the biological parents of these children out of the picture of humanity, close quote. In a better day and time, our national stomachs would have turned reading that. It is such a wretched comment. Today it comes off as sophisticated and gets rewarded. Professor Kendi is the ideal modern embodiment of the neo-Marxist view that replaces the class struggle with the race struggle. Everything must be viewed via the lens of race, which is an abandonment, of course, of all previous moral grounding that everything should be rather viewed via the natural law of human nature. To put it bluntly, Amy Barrett thought she was adopting human children and giving them a better life. Professor Kendi sees her robbing black creations of some kind and converting them to something unnatural. Certainly the neo-Darwinism cannot be ignored here either, as a destiny is also outlined. Race determines, or should determine destiny, according to Kendi. And to go back to what I mentioned earlier, this is also part and parcel of group or collective responsibility and guilt, not just of Republicans or conservatives, but all of America that doesn't buy into the left-wing narrative. He writes a major essay justifying this position in the current issue of the Atlantic Monthly. Denial is the heartbeat of America is the title, and the jumping off point for him is all the statements about the riot on the Capitol last week, and those who have said such things as, "This is not who we are." Let me quote him from his piece. Quote, "To say that the attack on the U.S. Capitol is not who we are is to say that this is not part of us, not part of our politics, not part of our history. And to say that this is not part of America, American politics, and American history is a bald-faced denial. But the denial is normal. In the aftermath of catastrophes, when have Americans commonly admitted who we are? The heartbeat of America is denial," he continues. "It is historic, this denial. Every American generation denies. America is establishing the freest democracy in the world," said the white people who secured their freedom during the 1770s and 1780s. "America is the greatest democracy on earth," said the property owners voting in the early 19th century. "America is the beacon of democracy in world history," said the men who voted before the 1920s. "America is the leading democracy in the world," said the non-incarcerated people who have voted throughout U.S. history in almost every state. "America is the utmost democracy on the face of the earth," said the primarily older and better off and able-bodied people who were the likeliest to vote in the 21st century. "America is the best democracy around," said the American people when it was harder for Black and Native and Latino people to vote in the 2020 election. At every point in the history of American tyranny, the honest recorders heard the sounds of denial, and today is no different. Close quote. American tyranny. Understand what he is saying. The claims that America is establishing the freest democracy in the world, regardless of who may or may not have said such a thing in the 18th and 19th centuries, was and is indisputably true, and was recognized as true not just by us, but other countries as well. It was not a lie of any kind or any denial. It simply is and was a fact. Compared to every country in the world, at least, that it was and could be said by non-incarcerated people, as he puts it, makes me want to ask, do you not think criminals should be incarcerated? What's wrong with free people proclaiming, if not boasting, of freedom? And why would not that be a standard to distinguish between the criminally imprisoned versus the law-abiding who respect the laws? Perhaps the people who stormed the Capitol should be among the non-incarcerated? I simply don't understand his point. Or maybe I do. Only if you think America is fundamentally unjust can you think criminals should not be imprisoned here. And only if you collapse all mathematical and natural reasoning can you believe that what 250 people do in breaking a law in a country of 250 million adults, that represents 250 million adults who did not break the law. In other words, what Professor Kendi cannot understand is the difference between political majorities and political minorities, or even extremists. But to think that, say, a group of rioters represents the whole of the country is to also say that anything can represent anything. Thus, how is it the rioters can represent those who didn't riot and denounced the rioters, but that he, Kendi, himself is not representative of the rest of the country? Why, in other words, does Kendi get to decide who speaks for whom? I denounced the rioters. Kendi thinks the rioters represent me. I also denounce Kendi. What makes Kendi think he doesn't represent me too under his odd reasoning? Because he doesn't, just as the rioters don't. His arbitrary attachment of negative statements or actions to positive majorities is simply irrational. I suppose it is such irrationality that allows him to conflate the imprisoned with the free. No distinction matters except arbitrary ones he creates to fit his own narrative. He writes about several failed and attempted coups in America. We need not rehash that long history, but we should point out they failed precisely because the vast majority of the country and its leadership wanted no truck, affiliation, association, or countenance with or for those coups. If minority viewpoints represented majority viewpoints, then quite obviously Professor Kendi's views must represent all of our views. No? course not. But again, that can be the only implication of his collapsed understanding of history and politics, and why he can indict all of America as, of course, systematically racist, as much as it is systematically unjust. As he preaches and teaches for one of the most elite institutions in the world with a multi-million-dollar endowment supporting his work, if you can call what he does actual work. If you think this is just some crazy and isolated example of an academic ivory tower elite, it is not. It is the same reasoning and philosophy that allows Andrew Cuomo to say America was never that great, and that gives every elected Democrat I know of the ability to say we are a systematically racist society. It is the same reason and philosophy that thinks it's okay, be it at the Smithsonian or the New York Times, to have projects on teaching whiteness and identifying attributes of whiteness, being family formation, Christianity, and the belief that work should come before play as an emblem of whiteness. My own sense, 85% of Kenya is not white, though it is Christian. 80% of American blacks identify as Christians compared to 70% of whites. Think about that. And if the main doctrine of Christianity is to love one another regardless of race or anything else, and if more children can be raised in loving and intact families, I think we all agree we'd all have a lot less problems. Of course, all of these things, religion, family, and plain old common sense rooted in human nature, is what Marxism attacks and goes after. Is what professors like Ibram Kendi go after. And it informs too much thinking here in America, way too much. Chris Rufo, over at the City Journal, writes about what he found in a third grade class in Cupertino, California this week, headquarters of the Apple Corporation, Cupertino is. Here's what the 8-year-olds are getting there. Quote, "The teacher explained that the students live in a dominant culture of white, middle-class, cisgender, educated, able-bodied Christian English speakers who, according to the lesson, created and maintained this culture in order to hold power and stay in power." Close quote. 8-year-olds. They don't want you white. They don't want you Christian or speaking English. Fill that in with anything else. Black, Muslim, Spanish, Asian, Jewish, Chinese. And you know what we would call that? Racist. Or we used to. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.